The prairie winds carried with them more than dust and whispers, they carried secrets. Out on the edge of the old American frontier, in the late 1800s, a small village sat like a lonely ember, glowing against the vast wilderness. The wooden cabins creaked under the touch of time, their shutters rattling as though holding back stories too heavy for daylight. Horses stomped along the dirt path where wagons rolled slow and steady, and the clang of a blacksmith's hammer was the rhythm that stitched the days together. Yet behind the sound of hammers and hooves, something quieter stirred, something that belonged not to iron and wood, but to hearts that dared to feel. The people of this village lived simple lives. Women tended to gardens that bloomed stubbornly in rocky soil. Children ran barefoot through the fields chasing laughter, and men worked the land with hands calloused by both toil and hardship. But among them lived one who did not quite belong to either the cabins or the cornfields. He was Apachitol, strong, carrying with him the silence of the desert and the storm of battles fought long before most could remember. His presence was both respected and feared. Some said his eyes held the weight of the mountains. Others whispered that he carried the spirit of his ancestors wherever he walked. He seldom spoke, and when he did, it was with words measured like arrow-sharp, precise, and rare. It was said he came to the village not by choice but by chance. A wounded rider who had stumbled into their care and once healed had stayed, perhaps for shelter, perhaps for reasons none could guess. He kept mostly to himself, repairing tools, hunting deep in the woods, and returning with game that fed those who could not provide for themselves. Yet his silence made him a mystery. Mysteries are dangerous things in small towns where curiosity grows as fast as suspicion. But where others saw a stranger, wrapped in shadows, one young maid saw something different. She was quiet herself, though not for lack of words. Her shyness was like a veil she wore, keeping her thoughts safe from the judging eyes of others. While she worked sweeping the dust from the floorboards of the trading post or mending torn garments by candlelight, her gaze often wandered to the tall figure who passed by without asking for company, yet whose silence seemed to call to her more loudly than any voice. She told no one of the way her chest tightened when he appeared, nor of the warmth that spread through her when their eyes just for a moment met across the busy street. It was a secret she pressed close, a fragile thing, hidden like a letter tucked beneath the folds of her apron. For in this village, a quiet maid and an Apache warrior were never meant to belong to each other. Yet fate has a strange way of pulling two unlikely souls into the same corner of the world. It happened on an evening when the sky burned gold and crimson, the sun sinking behind the endless hills. The maid had wandered into the old cabin that served as the village's library, a place seldom visited now that chores claimed most of the daylight hours. The air inside smelled of pine wood and worn paper, shelves stacked with books whose pages had yellowed with time. And there, seated in a weathered chair, was the Apache. His eyes were closed, his broad chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of rest. His long hair spilled over his shoulders, catching the firelight from the lantern on the wall. The beads and feathers he wore told of another world, a world beyond the fences and fields, and yet here he was, still as a statue, silent as the desert night. At first, she froze at the doorway, torn between retreat and curiosity, but something in the scene held her still. He looked almost unguarded, though she could not be sure if he truly slept. Her heart beat so hard she feared it might echo against the wooden walls. She stepped closer, her shoes barely whispering against the floorboards. She told herself she only wanted to see if he was well. Perhaps he needed a blanket for the chill that crept in with the evening air. But her thoughts betrayed her as she reached his side. The lantern's glow softened his features, the strong lines of his jaw, the calmness carved into his brow. The quiet strength of a man who had lived 100 storms and still endured. She had never stood this close before, never dared to notice the way his skin seemed warm even in the dim light. A trembling thought passed through her. What would it feel like, just once, to touch him? To break the invisible barrier that had kept them apart, so the world itself had built a wall between their hands. Her fingers, hesitant as a moth's wings, hovered near his arm. Every heartbeat felt like a drumbeat in her chest. She whispered to herself that it was foolish, dangerous, perhaps even wrong, but the pull was stronger than reason. With all the courage she could gather, she let her hand brush lightly against his wrist. It was the faintest touch, a secret gesture meant only for herself. A touch so soft it might have been mistaken for the passing of air. What she did not know was that the Apache was not asleep. His eyes remained closed, but he felt its delicate weight of her hand, the warmth trembling against his skin. And though he had faced battles fiercer than most men could dream, it was this shy, hidden touch that stole the very breath from his chest. In that moment, time seemed to stop. The library's silence deepened, the lantern's flame flickered, and the world outside faded into nothing. He fought the urge to open his eyes, to catch her in the act, to see the truth written on her face. But instead he lay still, heart thundering against his ribs, wondering why such a simple touch could unravel him so completely. And the maid she pulled her hand back quickly, as though burned by her own daring. Her cheeks flushed with shame and wonder all at once. Had she truly done that? Had she crossed a line no one would ever believe she dared to cross? She turned as though to flee, her breath quick and uneven, but stopped halfway, her hands trembling against the folds of her dress. Neither spoke. Neither moved beyond the small exchange of touch and silence, but both knew something had shifted, something that could not be undone. He, the warrior who pretended to sleep, and she, the maid whose shy courage had sparked a fire neither understood. Outside, the prairie wind howled, rattling the shutters as though urging them to remember the world's harshness. Yet inside that room, in the flicker of a lantern, two hearts had crossed a forbidden boundary. And though no one else in the village would ever know what had passed, the weight of it hung heavy between them. The Apache kept his eyes closed, though his every sense burned awake. The maid lingered near the door, torn between shame and longing. And in the space between them, filled with silence, flickering light, and secrets lay the beginning of something neither of them had words for. But, just as the maid's trembling hand reached for the door, she heard it. A sound that did not belong to the library's silence. A sound that made her blood run cold. A slow creak of the floorboard behind the shelves. Someone else was there, watching. The sound came again, soft but unmistakable, a floorboard groaning under hidden weight. The maid froze, her hands still trembling on the doorknob, heart racing like a trapped bird. She dared not turn, yet her eyes flicked toward the dim rows of bookshelves. Shadows gathered thick in the corners, bending with the lantern's glow. For an instant she thought it might be the wind rattling the old wood. But no, this was heavier, slower, like someone shifting their weight in secret. The Apache did not stir. His body lay still in the chair, broad chest rising and falling with that steady rhythm. But inside him, every sense sharpened. He had grown up listening for danger in the rustle of grass, in the crack of a twig under a stranger's boot. That small sound behind the shelves was no accident. Though his eyes remained shut, his muscles coiled beneath his stillness. He knew someone was there. The maid's throat went dry. She glanced once at the Apache, wondering if he had heard, if he would rise and protect her. But he did not move, and so she felt suddenly alone. Gathering courage, she stepped toward the sound, her slippers brushing against the wood floor. The lantern flickered again, as though warning her back, yet her shyness, her timidity, gave way to something stronger, curiosity. She had just touched what she thought untouchable. Perhaps tonight she could do the impossible twice. She peered around the corner of the tall shelf. Dust motes floated in the air, stirred by a breath too close. Her eyes caught the faint outline of a figure pressed into the shadow. For a heartbeat, she swore she saw the glint of eyes watching, unblinking, and the shape of a hand clutching the edge of the shelf. But as soon as she gasped, the space was empty. A chill swept through the library. She stumbled back, pressing a hand to her chest. The sound was gone. The figure, if it had been real, vanished into silence. She turned quickly, afraid to linger, and met the sight of the Apache's face. His eyes still closed, but his jaw tight, as though holding back words. She did not know he had listened to every beat of her frightened breath, unable to endure the tension. She hurried from the room, the heavy door closing behind her with a groan. Outside, the night air wrapped her in its cold embrace. The village was quiet, only the far-off bark of a dog and the creak of a weather vane breaking the silence. She pulled her shawl close, trying to shake the unease that clung to her skin. She told herself it was her imagination, a trick of lantern light and tired nerves. But deep down, she knew someone had been there. Someone had seen what was never meant to be seen. The Apache opened his eyes only after she was gone. Darkness pooled in his gaze as he stood slowly from the chair. His instincts told him danger lurked close. Danger not from the maid's shy hand, but from the unseen presence that crept where it did not belong. He walked to the shelf where she had peered, running his hand along the rough wood. Nothing. No prints, no scent, no trace, but the memory of movement. Still, he did not doubt her fear. He had felt it, strong as the wind before a storm. The next morning, the village awoke to its ordinary rhythm. Smoke curled from chimneys, children hurried to fetch water from the well, and men loaded wagons bound for the next town. Yet beneath the routine was a quiet stir, the kind only those with careful eyes could sense. Whispers traveled like hidden streams. Someone had seen a stranger near the woods at dawn, a shadow slipping between trees before the sun fully rose. The maid heard these murmurs while sweeping the trading post. Her hands tightened on the broom handle. Could it be the same figure? Could it be the one who had hidden in the library's shadows? She longed to ask the Apache, but how could she? To speak would mean confessing what she had done, the touch she had dared to give. Her cheeks flushed at the thought. She feared he might see her as foolish, or worse, dishonorable. And yet the memory of his stillness, the way he had not flinched beneath her secret touch, burned in her mind. Did he know? Did he feel it as she had? Meanwhile, the Apache moved through the day with the same silence he always carried. But within him lay questions heavier than stones. Who had been in the library? Why hide? And why at the very moment the maid's hand brushed against his skin? He could not ignore the unease that gnawed at him. He had lived through raids, betrayals, ambush. The danger rarely announced itself loudly. It crept first as whispers, as shadows that slipped into the edges of safe places. By midday, he left the village for the woods, carrying his bow across his back. The forest was his refuge, the place where he could think without the weight of curious eyes. But even among the towering pines and the call of crows, he felt watched. The signs were faint, a broken branch here, a trail pressed too sharply in the earth there. Someone unfamiliar had passed this way. He crouched, running his fingers along the soil, and confirmed his suspicion. Boots, not moccasins. Not the feet of the people who belonged here. Outsiders. He returned at dusk, with no game in hand, only heavier thoughts. As he walked through the village, the maid caught sight of him from across the path. Their eyes met for only an instant, but it was enough. She saw the storm in his gaze, the weight of something unspoken. And though she looked quickly away, her heart ached with the sense that their fates were now bound by more than a single touch in a silent library. That night, she lay awake in her small room above the trading post. The wind rattled the shutters, and every creak of the old boards made her flinch. She thought again of the figure in the shadows, of the way it had slipped away without a sound. She thought of the Apache, sitting still as stone but alive with a hidden fire. And she thought of what it might mean if someone had truly been watching. In a village like theirs, secrets never stayed hidden long. The Apache, too, did not sleep. He sat outside beneath the stars, his eyes scanning the dark fields. The memory of her touch lingered on his skin. But it was not the warmth of her hand that kept him awake. It was the knowledge that eyes other than hers had been upon them. He did not know yet if those eyes belonged to friend or foe. But he knew one thing with certainty. The quiet life he had built here was about to change. The maid awoke the next morning to find a bundle left on the doorstep of the trading post. Wrapped in rough cloth, it contained a single feathered dark, stiff, tied with a strip of leather. She stared at it, breath-catching. It was not the kind of token left by chance. It was a sign, a warning. Or perhaps a message meant only for one man, the Apache. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. She wanted to hide it, to pretend it was nothing, but deep down she knew it was tied to the secret that now bound them both. Somewhere out there, someone was watching. And the touch she thought had been her own private daring might have lit a fire far larger than she ever imagined. The feather weighed little in her hands, yet it felt as if it carried the weight of the entire prairie sky. The maid stood frozen in the doorway of the trading post, staring at the dark quill tied with leather, a chill running through her spine. She glanced quickly down the street, but the morning road was empty, save for a wagon rolling past and a boy chasing a stray chicken. Whoever had left it knew how to slip away unseen. She tucked the feather into the folds of her apron, her heart pounding with the fear that someone might notice. The Apache had been watching from a distance. His sharp eyes had caught the small motion of her bending to pick up the bundle, the unease in her posture. He did not approach at once, but his steps carried him toward her slowly, deliberate as always. When she finally noticed him, her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she considered hiding the feather completely, pretending it was nothing. But his gaze told her it was useless. He had already guessed. She pulled it out carefully, placing it into his large hand without a word. His fingers closed around it, and he studied the quill with an expression unreadable to most. Though she thought she saw a shadow darken his eyes, he said nothing. But his silence spoke of recognition, of old memories she could not reach. She wanted to ask what it meant, but her lips failed her. He slipped the feather into the leather strap across his chest and walked away, leaving her with more questions than she had dared to carry before. That day, whispers again stirred in the village. Some said cattle had been spooked near the creek, bolting at shadows. Others swore they saw riders beyond the ridge, figures too far to make out clearly, but not belonging to any familiar homestead. Tension began to seep into the daily routine like smoke from a hidden fire. Men tightened the grips on their rifles when they rode out, and women gathered children closer to the safety of the cabins. Yet none spoke directly of what they feared. In towns like these, silence sometimes covered dread better than words. The maid tried to quiet her own fears by burying herself in chores. She stitched torn sleeves, swept dust from floors, baked bread until the air was thick with the scent of yeast, but no task was strong enough to distract her from the image of the Apache's face when he looked at the feather. It had not been confusion. It had been recognition. She knew then that whatever mystery lingered was tied not to her, but to him. Yet, through that single touch in the library, she had been pulled into his storm that night. As the lanterns dimmed and shutters were latched, the Apache left the village quietly. He moved with the grace of one accustomed to shadows, his bow across his back, the feather tucked safely against him. He followed the trail beyond the ridge where the whispers claimed riders had passed. The moon lit the land in silver, and every sound seemed sharper the rustle of leaves. The call of a lone owl, the soft trickle of water. He crouched low when he found prints pressed into the earth again, boots not belonging to the village. His hand brushed the dirt, feeling the story it told. More than one rider, moving fast, keeping low. Outsiders indeed, and not by accident. Meanwhile, back in the village, the maid sat by her window, unable to sleep. She told herself she had no reason to worry about where he went, that his life was not tied to hers. But her heart refused such logic. She thought of his silence, his stillness, and the way danger never seemed to catch him unaware. Whoever had left that feather had meant for him to find it. And if it was a warning, then he was walking straight into its teeth. As the days passed, the sense of unease grew thicker. The blacksmith muttered about tools missing from his shed, and the miller swore he saw smoke rising far off where no home should be. Children were told not to wander near the woods. Still, the Apache kept his silence, and the maid kept her secret. The village lived on the surface of calm, while underneath something dark moved steadily closer. But there was another tension rising too. It's quieter and more dangerous in its own way. The maid and the Apache had not spoken of that night in the library, yet every glance they exchanged in passing carried an unspoken truth. She felt it when his eyes lingered, a heartbeat longer than necessary, when her hands trembled not just from fear but from longing. She feared someone else might notice, that the small fire inside her would be seen and judged. In a place where differences were already sharp, the sight of a shy maid and an Apache warrior carrying unspoken closeness would only feed the tongues of gossips and the eyes of those who did not forgive. The conflict grew on two fronts, one visible, one hidden. The visible was the threat that pressed closer from the hills, the riders who left no name but a feather. The hidden was the stirring of two hearts, bound by silence but burning too brightly to be ignored. One evening, just as dusk began to lay its purple veil across the land, the maid heard a commotion outside. She rushed to the door to see a horse staggering into the street, riderless foam streaking its flanks. The villagers gathered quickly, muttering in low tones, fear sharpening their voices. The horse belonged to a family living on the far edge of the settlement. No one knew what had driven it back alone. A group of men mounted up at once, rifles slung across their backs, rode out toward the homestead. The maid stayed at the edge of the crowd, her heart heavy. She saw the Apache among the riders, silent, his bow at his side. He did not look at her, but she felt the weight of his presence all the same. The sound of hooves faded into the growing night, leaving the village tense and waiting. Hours passed before the riders returned, their faces grim. They spoke little, but what they carried back chilled the air. A wagon wheel splintered, burned at the edges. The family was gone. The villagers spoke in frightened tones now. Some believed bandits were prowling the area. Others whispered of old grudges, men who did not want peace between natives and settlers. The maid listened, her hands clutching the folds of her dress. The feather returned to her mind, sharp as ever. Whatever was happening, it was not random. That night, she lit a candle long after the rest of the house slept. The flame flickered, and she thought of how fragile it looked against the heavy dark. She thought of the Apache, how he carried storms in silence, how he seemed always ready for danger, yet never bowed beneath it. And she thought of the touch she had stolen, the breath it had stolen from him. Somehow, she knew this was only the beginning. That both of them were caught in a web far larger than they could see, and still the shadows watched. From the edge of the hills, from the cracks of the forest, eyes waited and followed. The maid did not yet know if those eyes belonged to enemies seeking harm or to old ghosts chasing the Apaches past. But with each day, the village felt less safe. Her heart felt more entangled in a fate she had never chosen. The feather had not just been a warning. It was a mark, a sign that old struggles had returned to claim what peace they had built. The maid clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she whispered to herself the truth she feared most. The village was no longer just a village. It was a battleground waiting to be claimed. The nights grew colder, and with each one the air in the village thickened with fear. Fires burned longer, doors were barred sooner, and even the dogs seemed restless, pacing the edges of the cabins as though they sensed what no one dared to speak aloud. The riders in the distance had not shown themselves openly, yet their shadow loomed larger each day. Livestock went missing, wagon tracks were found where no wagon should have passed, and twice now the church bell rang in the dead of night without a soul near the rope. The villagers whispered of curses, of vengeance, of enemies creeping closer, but none could point to a name. The maid moved about her days with quiet eyes, her steps careful, her heart never at peace. She thought of the family that had vanished, of the burned wagon wheel, of the feather that had appeared at her door. Though she never spoke of it, the memory haunted her like a phantom she could not shake. She often caught herself glancing toward the Apache when he passed, hoping for answers in his silence. But he gave none. His face was as calm as ever, though his eyes carried storms. One evening, she found him outside the trading post, sharpening the edge of his knife against a whetstone. The sound was slow, steady, each scrape louder than the last in the quiet street. She lingered, unsure whether to speak, then gathered her courage. The feather. It wasn't the first, was it? Her voice trembled, more from the weight of her question than the chill of the night. He paused but did not look at her. His hand stilled on the blade, the silence heavy between them. At last he spoke, his voice low. It belongs to a brotherhood. Old, ruthless. They do not forget. He slid the knife into its sheath and stood, towering over her, but not unkind. They leave feathers when they hunt. Not animals, men. Her breath caught. And now, they hunt you. He turned his gaze to the horizon, where the dark line of the hills cut against the stars. Not only me. His eyes shifted back to hers, and in that moment she felt the truth sink deep. Whatever was coming, it threatened them all. From that night forward, tension became a companion no one could escape. The men of the village took turns guarding the outskirts, rifles ready, lanterns glowing faint in the dark. The women prayed longer in the church, their whispers rising like smoke. Children were kept close, their laughter replaced by the hush of warnings. And through it all, the Apache moved with a quiet certainty, as though he alone understood the scale of the storm closing in. The maid began noticing small things others overlooked. A horse tethered too near the woods, gone by dawn. A mark carved into the old mill door, strange and deliberate. Once, while fetching water from the well, she saw a glimmer in the distance, metal catching the sun, the unmistakable gleam of a rifle aimed from far away. By the time she blinked, the figure was gone. She said nothing, but her hands trembled on the bucket rope all the way home. Her nights were no better. She dreamed of feathers drifting through her room like black snow, of footsteps outside her window, of eyes burning in the dark. Sometimes she awoke certain she had heard the creak of the trading post stairs, only to find silence waiting. More than once she thought of fleeing, of asking to be taken to a safer town, but each time her thoughts turned back to him, the Apache. If he stayed, then so would she. It was on a restless night. While the lantern burned low and shadows flickered along the walls, that she heard it again, the sound of wood groaning beneath weight. Her heart lurched, carrying her back to the memory of the library, the first time she had known someone else was watching. She held her breath, listening. This time it was closer, deliberate. She reached for the candle, but before she could light it, a hand covered the flame. She turned sharply, only to find the Apache standing in the dark, silent as a ghost. "Stay quiet," he whispered. His tone was sharp but protective, the kind that demanded obedience. He moved to the window, his broad frame outlined by the faint glow of moonlight. She followed his gaze, peering through the slats. At first she saw nothing but night. Then slowly the shape of riders came into view, shadows on horseback. Circling the outer cabins, moving with predator patience, her knees weakened. "They're here," she breathed. He gave a single nod. Not yet ready to strike. They wait, watching. He stepped back, his hand tightening on the bow at his side. But they want fear first. Fear makes the prey weak. The maid clutched the edge of the table, her breath unsteady. "What do they want with us?" "With you?" His eyes burned like coals in the dark. "They want blood, mine, and those who give me shelter." The next days passed in a blur of dread. The riders never entered openly, but signs of their presence multiplied. Carcasses of animals were left at the edge of the fields, stripped clean. Arrows appeared lodged into doors at dawn, each tied with a dark feather. The men argued, some wanted to pack up and leave, others swore to fight. The preacher urged them to trust in prayer, but his voice shook as he spoke. The village stood divided. Division was the very thing the enemy desired. The maid watched it all unfold, her heart breaking with each new sign. And yet, in the midst of fear, her bond with the Apache deepened in silence. He never said much, but his presence near her steadied her trembling hands. And when their eyes met in fleeting moments, she felt strength flow where fear had been. She remembered the night she touched him, the way he had pretended to sleep, but had felt every heartbeat of her daring. That single moment had bound her to him, and now, as the storm swelled, she knew she could not turn away. But others had noticed. Whispers began among the villagers, soft at first, then sharper. They saw the way she lingered near him, the way he seemed to stand a step closer when danger pressed in. Some disapproved, muttering that her loyalty was misplaced, that no good would come from trusting a man with shadows in his past. And though she heard their words, she refused to let them change what her heart knew. One evening, As the sun sank low and the sky bled red across the horizon, the Apache stood at the edge of the village, staring toward the hills. She approached quietly, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. For a long while, neither spoke. Then, in a voice rough with memory, he said, "They will not wait much longer." Her chest tightened. "What will happen when they come?" He turned his head slightly, his gaze falling on her. "Clash, fire, blood." His words were simple, heavy. "But I will not let them touch you." She wanted to ask how he could promise such a thing when the riders seemed countless. But the way he said it left no room for doubt. His vow was not built of hope, it was built of iron. Still, fear clawed at her, and her hand reached out before she could stop herself, brushing against his arm as if to anchor him to her. His muscles tensed beneath her touch, but he did not pull away. That night, the village did not sleep. Lanterns burned in every window. Rifles rested across laps. Children huddled against their mothers. The Apache stood watch at the edge of the fields, his bow strung, his eyes never blinking. The maid stayed near the window, her heart echoing every shift of shadow, every creak of wood. Then it came, the distant sound of drums. Slow, steady, carried on the wind like the heartbeat of some vast beast. The villagers froze, listening. The Apache's posture stiffened, his jaw set. The maid pressed her hand to her chest, her pulse racing with the rhythm of the drums. From the darkness of the hills, torches appeared. First a few, then many, moving like fireflies across the ridge. Riders emerged, their silhouettes sharp against the glow, their weapons gleaming in the firelight. The drums grew louder, filling the night with a terrible certainty. The maid's breath came in short gasps. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down, as if the entire world held its breath. The Apache raised his bow, his eyes locked on the advancing figures. He did not move, did not speak, but his presence radiated a calm born of countless battles. The torches drew closer, the riders forming a line at the edge of the fields. They did not charge, not yet. They simply stood, watching, waiting, their silence louder than any war cry. The village lay caught between dread and defiance. Every soul bracing for the storm about to break, and in the center of it all, the maid felt her heart tethered to the Apache. Whatever happened next, she knew they stood on the edge of something that would change everything. The air was thick with smoke, with fear, with the unspoken bond between two unlikely souls. The drums stopped. Silence fell. A single rider stepped forward, his torch casting a shadow long across the ground. He raised his hand, and in it gleamed a blade. The signal was clear. The moment had come. The rider holding the torch sat motionless at the edge of the fields, his face hidden in the shadows of the firelight. Behind him, the others waited in silence, their horses stamping the ground, restless and eager. The Apache stood firm, bow in hand, watching the leader's every move. The maid pressed against the wall of the trading post, her breath shallow, her body tense as if any sudden sound might break the fragile barrier between peace and bloodshed. When the rider finally spoke, his voice carried across the fields like a growl. The words were not familiar to most of the villagers, but the Apache understood. It was a summons, a challenge spoken in the old tongue. The meaning was clear: come forward, face us, or watch your village burn. The Apache did not answer immediately. His silence stretched long, the weight of it pressing on everyone listening. Then, in a voice strong and steady, he replied in the same tongue, his words rolling like thunder. The maid did not know what he said, but she saw the reaction it stirred. The leader's hand tightened on the torch. His horse shifted. Behind him, the line of riders bristled, weapons flashing in the firelight. Whispers rippled through the gathered villagers. Fear clutched their voices. Some wanted to run, others to fight, but none moved without the Apache. He stepped forward, out of the safety of the shadows, until the torchlight painted his face. The leader lifted the feathered blade higher. The two men stared across the field. Warriors from different worlds, bound by a history too deep for others to understand. The maid's heart pounded. She thought of the feather left at her door, of the burned wheel, of the vanished family. She thought of the Apache's vow, that no harm would come to her. But as she watched him face the riders alone, she wondered how any man could hold back a storm so fierce. The standoff stretched into eternity. No one breathed. Then the leader turned sharply, signaling his riders. One by one, the torches lowered, and without a sound, they began to retreat. Melting back into the hills as silently as they had come, the drums started again, fading slowly into the night until nothing remained but the distant echo of their rhythm. Relief swept the village, but it was thin and trembling. Everyone knew this was no victory. It was only a warning, a promise of what was yet to come. The Apache returned to the heart of the village. His steps were calm, his face unreadable, but inside he carried the heaviness of truth. These men were not ordinary raiders. They were bound by vengeance, tied to his past, and they would not stop until the debt they claimed was paid. The maid found him later, standing near the well, staring at the dark water. She approached carefully, clutching her shawl close. "What did they say?" she whispered. "They called me by name," he answered. His voice was low, but she felt its weight. "They come for what was done long ago." She searched his face, but he gave her no more. Only silence, heavy with the knowledge that his past had now caught the entire village in its grip. The days that followed were restless. Men doubled the guard at night, women kept food stored close, and children were told not to stray beyond the cabins. The Apache spent his hours patrolling the outskirts, reading the land, searching for signs of the rider's return. The maid, though afraid, found herself drawn to him more than ever. She brought water when he worked, mended the leather of his quiver. Though few words passed between them, the closeness grew in the quiet spaces. Yet whispers spread. Some of the villagers began to question his presence, muttering that his enemies were now theirs, that if he left, the danger might leave with him. The maid overheard these words more than once, her heart aching at their cruelty. She wanted to defend him, to tell them he had given them more than food and protection. He had given them a chance to stand strong. But she was shy, and fear of their judgment kept her voice small. One evening, as the sky turned gold and shadows stretched long, the blacksmith gathered a small group outside the church. Their voices were sharp, their eyes suspicious. The maid lingered at the edge, listening. They wanted the Apache gone. They wanted to send him away before the riders returned in full force. The words struck her like blows. She hurried away before they saw her tears, her steps carrying her to the only place she felt safe, the library. She sank into the worn chair where she had first dared to touch him, her hands trembling against the wooden arms. She whispered to herself, "They don't see him. They don't see who he truly is." A shadow crossed the doorway, and she lifted her head to find him there, watching her. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he stepped inside, his gaze softer than she had ever seen it. "They want me gone," he said quietly. Her lips parted, but no words came. She nodded once, unable to lie. "I will not leave," he continued. "Not because of me. Because of you?" Her heart leaped and broke all at once. She wanted to tell him she had never meant for him to stay for her, that she feared what it might cost him. But his eyes held hers, steady, unflinching. And she knew nothing she said could change his resolve. That night the riders returned. This time there were no drums, no torches at a distance. They came like a storm, swift and merciless, pouring from the hills with fire and steel. The village erupted in chaos, shouts, gunshots, the clash of metal. Horses screamed and the air filled with smoke. The maid clutched the edge of the doorframe, terror freezing her in place. She saw the Apache at the center of it all, his bow singing, his knife flashing in the firelight. He moved like a shadow, unyielding, protecting every cabin, every life he could reach. She wanted to run to him, but fear held her still. The riders pressed harder, circling, trying to cut through the defenses. Flames licked at the edges of the fields. The blacksmith fell, rifle slipping from his hands. The preacher pulled children into the church, his voice shouting prayers over the din. And through it all, the Apache stood, unbroken, his figure a wall against the storm. The maid's fear turned to fire. She grabbed a bucket, running to the well, her hands blistering as she hauled water to douse the flames. Others followed her lead, women and children passing water, beating back fire with blankets. The battle raged, but for the first time, the village fought as one. Hours passed like years. At last, the riders began to falter. Their leader fell from his horse, struck by an arrow that burned bright in the torchlight. The others hesitated, their fury breaking, and with a final cry they fled into the hills, leaving behind smoke and silence. The village stood in ruins, but alive. Slowly, the people gathered, their faces streaked with soot and tears. They looked to the Apache not with suspicion, but with gratitude. He had stood when others would have fallen. He had given them more than defense. He had given them courage. The maid found him near the well. Blood streaked across his arm, but his posture unbroken. She reached for him without hesitation this time, her hand resting against his skin, no longer a secret touch, but a truth shared in the open. He looked down at her, and though his face was weary, his eyes held a gentleness she had never seen. The riders would not return. Not soon, perhaps not ever. The cost had been heavy, but the village had survived. And in the silence that followed, the maid realized something had changed. No longer shy, no longer afraid, she had found her voice in the fire. She had stood with him. Together they had endured. The prairie winds carried the scent of smoke away, leaving behind the stillness of dawn. The cabins would be rebuilt, the wounds would heal, and stories of the night would be told for years to come. But in the quiet corner of the library, where one touch had begun it all, the maid and the Apache knew their story was no longer hidden, in a land where survival was never promised. They had found something rare strength not only in steel, but in each other. And as the sun rose over the hills, painting the sky with light, the maid breathed deeply, her heart steady at last. The danger had passed, but the memory would remain a reminder that even in the harshest times, courage, trust, and love could still bloom like wildflowers on the prairie.